Good evening. Thank you for coming to the University of Colorado. My name is Ben Teitelbaum. I am a professor of international affairs and ethnomusicology here at the college, and also a frequent collaborator with the Center for Western Civilization here on campus. It is a pleasure to welcome you this evening. Our guest this evening is Mattias Karlsson. The name of his speech to us today is National Conservatives and Traditional Conservatives, a Call to Unity. Having spoken with a number of people in the room tonight, and also knowing some of the attendees, I know that our audience this evening is not exclusively conservative, not populated by political conservatives exclusively. And I say even to those of you who would fit outside of that category that Mattias's subject this evening is relevant for you. If you are interested in the development and the flow and currents of politics throughout the world, and this talk, this item, this subject should be a concern to you. Mattias Karlsson was born in 1977 in Rottne, in a small town in southern Sweden, in the province of Småland. He grew up in that area, but in 2002 joined a political party that was at the time very, very small and in many cases discredited and ignored by much of the political mainstream in the country. That party was called Swedish or the Sweden Democrats. In 2002, he joined in 1999, but in 2002, Mattias Karlsson became the first fully employed member of this political party. And he would slowly, throughout the years, ascend its internal hierarchy to become not only the position that he holds today, unofficially, the chief ideologue of the party, having written most of their party platforms, and in some cases, key speeches. But also alternately an interim party leader when the erstwhile party leader, Eaton has been on leave. The Sweden Democrats are a political party that has reshaped and revamped the landscape in Sweden fundamentally and forever. This is a political party that is formed from two sources. One of them, Democrats Svensk, which was a controversial white nationalist organization in early Sweden, and Sverigedemokraterna, Framstegspartiet, an anti-tax populism party that developed in the early 1980s. The two of those parties came together. Since that time, grappling with the more controversial roots of the party has been the occupation of leaders for quite some time. And the man who will be speaking after me, our guest tonight, Mattias Karlsson, has been one of the leading figures in pushing out what he sees as extremist elements from the party, and has been an ultimate foe of insiders in the party who have found themselves on what they consider to be the wrong side of that historical divide, pushing for a party that in his mind is anti-racist and committed to democracy. Nonetheless, the Sweden Democrats would stand out in the political spectrum because of their commitment, and really is the only voice for quite some time, to major reductions in the country's immigration levels. That became their signature, and it was what made this political party one of the fastest growing in Sweden's modern history. In 2010, the party entered parliament with 5.7% of the vote. That might sound little, but that was enough to push them over a 4% threshold, thereby making Sweden one of many countries in Europe that had a political party devoted primarily toward confronting immigration, multiculturalism, and the weakening of national sovereignty in the context of the European Union. Dealing with the past reputation that they had from their roots has always been a challenge for the party. At the same time, however, they've managed to convince a number of political actors throughout the continent, if not their country, that they in fact belong more in the mainstream of the political right. One of the paradoxes of the Sweden Democrats today is that even though they have, in some cases, rougher, more radical roots, within the broader context of parties mobilized against immigration, they are more moderate. Rejecting, of course, official confrontations with democracy, rejecting celebration of Putin, and underscoring some of that orientation, you might note, the Sweden Democrats have found themselves in the European Parliament in the same party consortium, the same political group as the Tories in Great Britain. that otherwise is a political party that the mainstream right in Sweden would find itself drawn to collaborate with. So there are divisions between the way this party is seen in an international context and the way that they have been seen traditionally within Sweden. Within Sweden, going into parliamentary elections last year, the political system was divided in this particular way. You had a center-right bloc that was comprised of 4 political parties, most of them having their signature as the liberalization of economic policies within Sweden. That would say, with this dealing with unemployment insurance, in some cases, in very, very narrow senses, also privatization of healthcare, versus a center-left bloc whose primary political party was the Social Democrats, the social democratic political force in Sweden that had, in so many different ways, defined the country and its political and social history throughout the 1900s. Those 2 blocs existed as more or less firm amalgamations, but the Sweden Democrats were outside of that. Historically, that made them kingmakers as well. After coming in 2010, they were able to tip the balance from one bloc to the other because neither of the 2 blocs had more than 50%. This is a parliamentary system. Going into 2018, that particular calculus seemed to be in place, where the Sweden Democrats would be the kingmakers opposite of center-right and center-left coalitions. That's some of the background to what Mattias is going to be talking to you about today, because the way that things are played out in that parliamentary system might not be intuitive to you, especially given what you might think of about alliances between a political right and a political left. When I say that his topic this evening is one that is of broad relevance, I'd ask you at the outset to think about what I just described to you. A political system, a parliamentary system that is comprised of small political parties. Think about mapping that onto our political system here. Yes, we have 2 parties as opposed to 8, but each of our major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, have factions to them. At the end of the day, in most cases, after, let's say, a presidential primary, the various factions will work out differences and line up in support of their party's candidate. But if you think of all those factions as instead political parties, in the European sense, then you might find yourself in a better position to understand what Mattias is going to be talking about today. What am I referring to with all that? Think back, for example, to 2004 to 2010, when the Tea Party movement became a force to be reckoned with in the Republican Party. And there was suddenly an internal divide between the establishment conservatives and the Tea Party. There we had a sort of factionalization. We had 2 different understandings of a political right forced to work things out with one another, or not, of course. More recently, with the rise of Donald Trump and right-wing or rightist populism, there too you see 2 conceptions of what a rightist, conservative, right-leaning Republican Party might be. And those various factions have had to negotiate their place together. Well, those terms that I've been using right now, establishment, conservative, you might even say traditional, Republicans, political right, conservatives. That is what Mattias is going to be referring to tonight, broadly speaking, with the term traditional conservatives. Mattias has reasons for using different terms, and I will let him qualify that when he begins to speak. But that is what he refers to there. Now, the other side, he talks about national conservatives. That's a term that could vaguely and broadly approximate what we might start to associate with the Tea Party, what we might associate with a populist movement, and in some ways like Trump, even though, again, I would caution you from drawing direct analogies between those 2 categories. But what Mattias is referring to with those terms is a newer type of right opposite an older one that seems to be changing the political map and terrain versus one that had been established and standardized in much of our political discourse and elections. That's the background, and I hope that you think about that and observe it as he speaks here, to note that these issues are not in fact specific to Sweden, but in many ways they're reshaping politics throughout the West. So that I don't continue blabbing and taking up time from his speech, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Mattias Carlson to speak.
Hello, and thank you very much for coming here tonight to listen to what I have to say and for the opportunity to speak at the university. Maybe I should start by commenting some of the things that Ben said. Ben likes labels and definitions, and that has been a large part of the debate surrounding my party. It's been a lot of focusing on how the party started. I don't fully agree with the description that Ben made. For example, one of the movements he mentioned that he labeled as white nationalists. I don't agree that they were white nationalists, and I also don't agree that my party came from that movement, because it was closed down 2 years before my party started. But I don't think that is really relevant today, because so much have happened. Personally, I was about 10 years old when all this took place. And the Sweden Democrats today is one of the main players in Swedish politics, and we're also becoming increasingly important within the European cooperation and also in European politics. And the development of our ideology, our principles, and how we are viewing ourselves has changed the party to its core. And today we define ourselves as being conservatives. But I think that in an international context, we would probably use the label national conservatives, because we are putting more emphasis, maybe than the traditional conservatives, on issues like national sovereignty, national identity, culture, and also maybe because we are a little bit more inclined to accept collective solutions to different forms of economical, social problems than maybe the traditional liberal conservatives of the US and the Anglosphere. So the reason for why I'm in America, and I would also like to apologize for my bad English, is because I was a part of a delegation from the Swedish Parliament to the United Nations and the International Parliamentary Union. So I was in New York for a few days on behalf of the Parliament in Sweden. And the reason why I'm here and why I'm going to Washington and other places is mainly to try to address American conservatives. And I know that many of you here is not conservatives. But I think that there are many reasons to why conservatives of different sorts in Europe and conservatives in America should start to cooperate more closely than we have. The American conservatives have for many decades had a close relationship and cooperation with the traditional conservative, liberal conservative movements in Europe, like, for example, the Tories in the Swedish case, Moderaterna, the Moderate Party, and so forth. But I think that there's also strong reasons for them to start cooperating with conservative parties like mine. And I understand why that hasn't taken place before. First of all, just a decade ago, we were not really a relevant political factor in the same sense as we are now. And second of all, there has been a history that I understand have made American conservatives hesitant of cooperation with parties like mine. The challenges towards, you must remember that the European nations, and especially in my case Sweden, was for a very long time almost like a tribes. Sweden was for 1,000 years or more extremely homogeneous when it comes to culture, religion, ethnicity, identity, customs, traditions, and so forth. And when challenges towards that identity first occurred a couple of decades ago, many of the movements like mine had a problem of distinguishing between ethnicity and culture and identity, because that had always been the same thing and mixed. And that led to some early mistakes and taking the wrong turn in some instances. But I think that my party has very, very, very firmly moved away from that. We are not considering ethnicity or where you're born or the color of your skin as a relevant factor in any case. It's just about culture, identity, loyalty. And I would say that almost all the parties in Europe that are similar to mine have gone in the same direction. And that process is done, more or less. But as I said, this is a partisan address, and it's mostly directed towards conservatives in America. But I would like to start with a quote from one of the conservative philosophers that have inspired me the most, and that is the British conservative philosopher Sir Roger Scruton. He writes in his book, The Meaning of Conservatism, that, quote, "Conservatism must out of necessity take many forms. Solon, when asked what is the best form of government, answered for whom and at what time. It is a certain country, a certain history, a certain way of life that commands the respect and the energy within the conservative." End of quote. In other words, there are and there must be real differences between conservative movements in different countries. And that is a good thing. I think that the conservative movements of different countries would be less successful than they are if they had tried to be more similar. For example, as a conservative, I believe in values such as duty, hard work, and self-sufficiency. But as a Swedish social conservative, national conservative, I still probably will never see eye to eye with the traditional liberal conservatives of America when it comes to issues like levels of taxation, the welfare state, and so forth. And that is because I am a Swede. And our way of organizing our social and financial system is unique to our small corner of the world. And it is deeply intertwined with the history, the identity, the culture, and the mentality of my nation. And the same goes, of course, for the American system and American conservatives. But luckily, I don't believe that to be a bad thing. I don't think that it's necessary for conservatives in Sweden and conservatives in America to share the exact same view on what level of taxation we should have and how we should organize ourselves. And it doesn't really matter in a great sense. And as I'm going to speak about more here, I think that these kind of questions concerning material issues are also becoming less and less important. One of the reasons why I'm here is that I'm seeing a very, very important change in how, in the political world of the West, especially in Europe, but also here in America. We have seen a seismic shift in the political landscape. And what I'm seeing is a movement away from material issues and away from the traditional left-right conflict. And what I'm seeing instead is an emerging conflict along the line of, best described, I think, with the conflict between anywheres and somewheres. I guess you've heard of those concepts. Where the anywheres are people who are, in most cases, left liberals, who believe in globalization, who believe in multiculturalism in many issues, who doesn't really think that history, tradition, and where you come from is that important, and who doesn't really put that much emphasis on questions like national security and border control and so forth. And the somewheres is then the opposite. People who think that, believe and feel that they are rooted in a specific historical, social tradition and context, and believe that to be very important and dear to them in many ways, and who feel that there is an emerging threat to their identity, to the sovereignty of their nation, and basically what their society is and who they are. And that has been very clear in Sweden, as Ben mentioned. This conflict has completely changed the political landscape of Sweden. That has been pretty much the same for 100 years. Swedish politics used to be very predictable and very boring. The Moderate Party and the Social Democratic Party argued about whether the levels of taxation should be 2% more, 2% less, and then the Social Democrats won and got 2% more taxes. That's basically how the election campaigns looked for many, many decades. And both these major parties have had allies, smaller parties who believed more or less in the same principles of more or less taxes. But what we saw now was a government crisis that was also new to Sweden. Usually that is a swift process, very efficient, would usually take a week or two. And now we went 6 months without the government, without the prime minister, because the new emerging conflicts changed everything. Some of the parties who used to be in alignment with the moderate party, who consider themselves to be liberal, they lean towards the anywhere position. For them, matters of multiculturalism, globalization, open borders, and this multilateral organizations, cooperation, very deep cooperation with the European Union and so forth, is the most important thing, are the most important things. Whereas big fractions of the moderate party and the Christian Democratic Party became more and more clearly anywheres, and more became similar to us, emphasizing questions like law and order, rule of law, national security, national culture, identity, and so forth. And that created a rift within the liberal conservative alliance of Sweden that eventually led to a breakup. So 2 of the liberal parties ended up joining the socialists, the Social Democrats. And the current prime minister became elected with the support of the former Communist Party, the Green Party, 2 of the most liberal parties, and then of course his own party, the Social Democrats. And in order for that to happen, both the Liberal Party and the Social Democratic Party, and also in some sense the former communists, had to really violate their core values, that the issues that they have been campaigning on for decades. So the Social Democratic Party now accepted to lower taxes for the wealthiest part of the population. And that used to be their main argument for not voting for the liberal conservatives. And you see many other issues like that. And to me that is a clear example of the fact that the old social economical conflict is now secondary to a new conflict between anywheres and somewheres. And it's not only in Sweden you see these tendencies, you see the same development in many European countries at the moment. Another trend is that the part of the liberal conservatives in Europe who are not moving to the left are moving more and more towards the national conservative standpoint, parties like mine. At the same time, you're seeing that parties like mine, who usually used to have, still have their voter base within the working class community, have been moving a little bit towards the right when it comes to economical issues. So we're actually seeing a merging of the old traditional liberal conservative movements in Europe and the new national conservative movements like my party, basically becoming more and more one unified movement. And I think that Ben mentioned our European cooperation. I think that is a good example of exactly that. Our current group in the European Parliament, the ECR group, consists of national conservative parties like mine, our friends in Denmark and Finland, Danish People's Party and the True Finns, but also with old liberal conservative, traditional conservative parties like the Tory Party in England, Law and Justice in Poland, and many other parties. So that we are actually in the front of this new unified movement. And it seems today like this movement is going to grow and it have a good chance of becoming the second largest group in the European Parliament after the elections in May. And that would be almost revolutionary. We would then have a leading group in the European Parliament, EPP group, that is traditionally liberal conservative, a little bit more at the liberal point of view. And then the second largest group will be the ECR group, consisting of national conservatives and liberal conservatives. and the socialists would be in third place. And that would, at its core, change the European Union and European politics. So what we're seeing now, just a decade ago or so, most of the European countries were led by socialist governments or social liberal governments. That is not the case today. It's just a few countries left with socialist governments. And what we're seeing instead is more and more countries are being governed by a coalition of national conservative parties and traditional liberal conservative parties. Our Sweden's neighboring countries, for example, Finland, Norway, Denmark, we see Austria, Switzerland, Greece, a couple of the Baltic countries, Belgium, all of these countries has seen an emergence of a coalition between national conservatives and traditional conservatives in government the last few years. We're also seeing some countries being governed by national conservative parties, countries like Italy, Poland, Hungary, and in many other countries we are seeing that the main opposition now are national conservative movements, for example France, the Netherlands, Slovenia, so forth. And in some other countries, the traditional liberal conservative parties have very clearly moved politically in the direction again towards national conservatives. Countries like Germany, where the CDU just recently changed the policies on border control and migration, the Tory party in Great Britain, where many supported the Brexit movement and so forth. So it's a completely different landscape in Europe today compared to just 10 years ago. And nothing is really speaking to the fact that this should be just a temporary thing, or that this movement is slowing down. So, and that also creates, I think, and that's why I'm here and why I'm giving a series of speeches in the US, very strong reasons for conservatives in America to try to form new coalitions and a stronger cooperation with the national conservative parties in Europe that are becoming increasingly more important. And one of the obvious reasons is that their old allies, the old liberal conservative parties of Europe, are in decline. And in almost no country anymore could they keep grasp and keep power by themselves. They need parties like mine to be in power. And if the US and if the conservatives in America want to keep in touch with what is happening in Europe, if the American conservatives want to have a chance to influence what is happening in Europe, then that is a strong reason for them to open up a dialogue and a stronger cooperation with the national conservative movement. And I think that is also maybe becoming increasingly important as we're seeing signs of a more multipolar world, where the US dominance is not self-evident anymore. We're seeing the rise of China, Russia, trying to reach for their own geopolitical goals. And for that reason, I think it's more important than in a very long time for America and for American conservatives to try to really keep in touch with what is happening and trying to, as much as they can, try to influence the development in a constructive direction. I also believe, as Ben mentioned, the main issue for my party and for many of our sister parties have been the question of migration. Basically, it's not really about migration, it's about preserving a national identity and a culture that has lasted or existed for 1,000 years or more. But migration, when it's not managed right, correctly, poses a threat to that. Many believe, I believe that. But I think that America and American conservatives also have reasons to try to follow the development concerning migration and migration policy in Europe very closely, because it affects America in different ways. The demographic development also creates a change in values in some European countries. For example, if you look at Sweden, who have accepted I'm not really sure about the numbers anymore because it keeps changing, but I think about 1 million people from the Middle East. That has empirically strengthened anti-American sentiments in my country. And you can see also the same development in many other European nations like France and other countries. And it has also definitely empirically strengthened anti-Semitism and anti-Israel views. And I'm not saying that all migrants from the Middle East have these kind of views, and many of them are very decent, good people. But there is a fact that Islamism, the movement of Islamism, has been growing in my country and many other countries, and with that comes also anti-American sentiments, anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli sentiments. So that, I think, is strong reasons for conservatives in America to keep an eye on this and also to try to get involved in some ways. Another reason, of course, is that since we have had close relations for a long time, America in many cases don't have the same security demands for traveling between the European countries and America as they have, for example, some other countries in the Middle East. And if we, as Sweden, has been very irresponsible with which people we are letting into our country, that poses a risk that some of the people actually have bad intentions and actually are terrorists. We have seen examples of that in Sweden. We had a terrorist attack in Stockholm a couple of years ago where many people were killed, and that was a person who didn't control properly. He had bad intention. He was an ISIS supporter, but he was still let into the country, and he might as well have retained the citizenship, and then after that went to America and performed his terrorist attack here. So there is a national security reasons for American conservatives to get involved in these issues. Another reason, and I think that is one of the most important reasons actually, is that it's the same way as we are seeing a merging of the national conservative movement and the liberal conservative movement in Europe into one unified movement. We are also seeing quite a big shift on the left side of politics. And I don't view that as a very constructive shift. In my opinion, views that used to be on the fringe or just belonging to smaller extremist groups or radical groups within the left are now becoming more and more mainstream. And I'm thinking particularly about identity policies that is becoming at the center of the left wing in both America and in Europe. And because the left are becoming more homogeneous and more unified, I think that is also a strong reason for the right side of politics to try to be more unified in opposition to that. Because what I'm seeing is basically the same arguments, the same narrative, the same attacks from the left on the right in almost every Western country today. So we are basically having the same debates in all of our countries, both in America and in Europe. And that is a strong reason in itself for us to try to exchange best practices and try to counter this new left movement. And in my view, this new identity policy left is a remnant of the communist movement when it's cultural policies. And I think that cultural Marxism is a relevant term. Marxism and communism was defeated on the economical level, it was defeated on a military level, but it has not yet been defeated on a cultural level. And we're also seeing that cultural debates and what is in America has been described as a cultural war in some cases, that is where the battlefield today in politics to a large extent are taking place. The Maoists in China and during the Cultural Revolution, they had 4 goals with the Cultural Revolutions, and that was to end what they called the Old Four. And the Old Four was religion, the old family structures, old customs and old traditions. And if I look at what identity policy left are trying to do, that is very similar. I'm not saying that they consciously are following in the footsteps of Mao Zedong, but basically it is to a large extent their energy and focus are directed at trying to weaken traditional religion, traditional families, traditional customs, and traditions in a sense. And that is, I think, more serious than the old conflict that surrounded taxation and the size of the welfare state and so forth, because that can be changed. But this is a battle about basically who we are as a civilization and as nations. And if that battle is lost, I think it will be very, very hard to reverse that process again. So it's a kind of an existential political conflict that we are seeing now. And for us who are who believe that the fact that we are parts of a Western civilization and culture, and that our traditions and our history matters, that is quite a serious problem. And we need to cooperate by surrounding, countering the attacks on that. And as I said, we will probably never agree. Conservatives in Sweden and conservatives in America will probably never really agree on what level of taxation is the optimal one, and how large should the state be, and these kind of things. But there are many things that I think that is even more important that we actually agree on. And that goes to the core of the conservative ideology. For example, we all believe in a realistic view of the world, that we all believe in thoughtful progress. We reject radical revolutionary solutions to problems. We all are anti-utopian in some sense. We all believe in defending our nations as a part of a distinct Western civilization built on the legacy, philosophical legacy from the ancient Greek and Rome, the Enlightenment, and on the Judeo-Christian tradition. We all have a positive view of the traditional family. We all put a lot of emphasis on questions like issues like rule of law and national security. We have a strong belief in freedom of speech, and I know that a lot of people on the left side of politics also have a strong belief in freedom of speech, but I see some worrying signs, though, when it comes to that question. One of those signs are the actions of the multinational media companies like Facebook and Twitter, and some signs that conservatives seem to be disadvantaged in how the algorithms are constituted and other things. And I know a lot of people, conservative people in Sweden, that have been shut down from Facebook because activists on the left side are reporting them for different reasons, even though they haven't violated any laws or anything. We're also seeing a tendency in Sweden. We have seen that for a long time, and it's actually become even a little bit better than before. But physical violence and physical attempts from the left, and it seems to be becoming more and more common here in America, that the radical left-wing groups are actually trying to physically silence voices that they don't agree with, conservative voices. And on this question, I think that we need to cooperate and to be really firm in our defense of freedom of speech that is at the center of democracy. I think that conservatives of all sorts have a shared belief in the importance of virtue and duty, and that effort should be rewarded. That we have a shared belief in virtues like beauty and tradition in art and architecture. And that we all believe that the issues surrounding national sovereignty and national identity and traditions are very important and something that we need to take care of and defend for the future and future generations. So that is some of the reasons why, that is some of how I look at the currents in politics at the moment, and the main reasons for why I believe that it's important that conservatives of all sorts in the West cooperate more closely in the future. Thank you.
Now I'll be happy to moderate questions for Mattias. Assuming you would like to get us started with the question. We can start with far back, yes.
Well, you talked about a traditional religion, and everybody knows that the Church of Sweden is a very theologically very liberal church. And what I want to know is there any sort of, in your opinion, is there any hope for like a sort of conservative Lutheran or even just any other Christian revival in Sweden?
I see very few signs of that, and I unfortunately I would say, even if I'm just an agnostic myself, but what we are actually debating and trying to preserve at the moment, there's not really hope of a religious revival in any sense, but we are actually defending if the Judeo-Christian tradition should have any place in the public sphere at all. And there's been a lot of heated debate on certain issues during the years. One of the main things is that we have a 500-year tradition of classes going to church at the end of the semester and singing traditional hymns that is mostly about Swedish nature and things like that, but they mention God in one or two places. And that has been a heated debate about those kind of things, or whether you should be allowed to teach kids in kindergarten about Christian traditions and so forth. And to me that is it's a question of national culture and national identity, to try to remove everything that is religious or Christian from the Swedish culture. It's a little bit like taking the eggs out of the cookie after you baked it. It's so intertwined. Our flag contains a Christian cross. We have been a Christian nation for 1,000 years. So that is really where the line of conflict are, not really if we are becoming a more religious country. That I don't see that happening in the nearest future anyway. But basically, should we be a completely secular country with no place for the Christian parts of our traditions or not?
Yes.
Actually, I find that a very interesting question, because when you say aligning the conservative sides, after I've lived in the U.S. for 15 years plus, for me, the conservative side in the U.S. is very much about religion. And so when you talk about alignment, do you really understand that in the U.S. the conservative side is very religious, usually, generalizing, obviously?
Yeah, I understand that, and that is also, like I started with saying that conservative movements in different countries needs to be different, and I think that we should continue to be different in different ways, but I think that we need to cooperate more closely around issues that we actually agree on, and that is what the left is doing and has been doing for a very long time, and if we should be more equal and have a better chance of countering the energy of the new left. I think that we need to do what they're doing. They are also very different within different countries in some issues, but they unify on their core values and some main issues that they're really fighting hard for.
Yes.
I had a question regarding media influences, and you mentioned a little bit Facebook and Twitter. In the U.S., we see a lot of perhaps trustworthiness and responsibility taken away or blamed on the media. And I was thinking, in Sweden, how is the culture, or how is the take on media's responsibility right now? If you're coming from one side of the political spectrum versus the other, is one side blaming media more, or what do you see?
The political climate in Sweden is very polarized, as it is in America, and probably has never been such hard divisions. And I think both sides in some cases feel that they are being wrongly treated, but there's no question that conservative side feel that they are that the media, mainstream media, in many cases, are an active opponent towards our political views. And there are also some empirical facts to point to that there is some truth to that. If you look at, the example, how the journalists in Sweden are voting and how they're affiliating politically, about somewhere between 85 and 90% are on the left side, left liberal side. I think my party has almost 1/5 of the votes in Sweden at the moment, but in the latest survey I saw, it was less than 1% of the journalists sympathized with my party, and that is pointing to something. I think that is kind of problematic, and also a reason why we're seeing alternative media growing online.
Can I see that there are other questions here. I'm going to take the liberty as moderator to jump in with a question here. So when you talk about an alignment between traditional conservatives and yourself, one thing that could be mixed up in translation in all this is when you use the word liberal. In the United States, of course, we think of the left. Right? Tricky thing with that word is in Europe it means political right. It has to do with free market capitalism, with liberalizing regulations and smaller governments. So we're talking about political right there. In other parts of Europe, the national conservatives or populists have found that because of their economic policy, it made more sense to partner with, say, a populist left, like in Italy. Here in the U.S., Donald Trump's advances might have depended on his economic rather than non-economic, non-materialist politics in order to win in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and that gave him, of course, the victory. Why shouldn't a party like yours, because of say your economic policies, because you're not necessarily a liberal in that sense, why isn't it more intuitive for you to partner with, say, the socialists?
First of all, I think there's some truth to the fact that usually the national conservatives, as I call them, you can call them populists if you want, are more to the left, but that is relative when it comes to economical questions. And that is also actually one of the explanations why we are now seeing a majority consisting of the old traditional conservative parties and the new national conservative parties, because we have a possibility to attract working class voters from the left and putting them in the right, and that is what's happening in many countries. But at the same time, we are also seeing a movement, as I said, that parties like mine are moving a little bit more to the right to be able to fit better together with the traditional conservative parties. And that has been the case with my party in Sweden, and I also see the same tendencies in several other countries, but everything is relative. In American context, we're all socialists. It's just a different kind of tradition and culture. I don't, at the moment, to cooperate with the Social Democrats in Sweden is just impossible for us, because their opposition to us is very close to hatred. And it's a very strong divide between us at the moment, and I think that they have been the driving force in that. But as I said, what we're also seeing is that the left are becoming more clearly anywheres in many different countries. They are making questions about open borders, globalization, EU federalism, and multiculturalism and so forth, their main issues, and that is making it almost impossible for us to cooperate with them. But there are some examples. In Denmark, for example, we are seeing more and more of a cooperation between our equivalent, the Danish People's Party, and the Social Democratic Party. But that is due to the fact that the Social Democratic Party in Denmark has adopted a lot of the policies of National Conservatives. So I don't know what's really is the egg and the hen there.
Yes.
So when you're talking about uniting the conservative movements, how long do you think it's going to take for it to happen in Sweden? You have DÖ, and then
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
Europe.
I hope and I believe that it will happen after the next election, and we're seeing some really good signs at the moment of a closer cooperation within Parliament, but also in networking and so forth. And at the moment, we are the moderate party in the Christian Democrats and the Swedish Democrats. We are now the opposition against them. We call it the Frankenstein Government, consisting of almost neoliberals, Greens, former communists, Social Democrats, and so forth. Really weird combination. and that in itself, that we will now be for several years in strong opposition together, I think will bring us closer together. And what you're also seeing is that both the Christian Democrats and the Moderate Party are adopting more and more of national conservative policies and becoming more and more like us. So it would be illogical almost to not form a common bloc after the next election. And you will also see that at the moment at the opinion polls, a government consisting of a conservative bloc, as we now have started to talk about in Sweden, of the Sweden Democrats, moderates, and us, are the most popular alternative among the population. And that in itself, I think, will drive this process.
You mentioned that the Anywheres, they don't value history. Is that fair? So I guess my question would be, how would you define valuing history, since there's so many different complexities that occur with different people's histories? How is there just one history that is valued?
I guess I think Anywheres could absolutely value history. What I meant was really valuing the institutions and traditions and customs that have been at the center of the nation's culture and the majority of the population for a very long time, that has specific historic roots connected to that specific nation. But of course, many people who feel like Anywheres could have a very strong historical interest and value different parts of history.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's very full of insights and provocations. So let me be provocative. In a context like the United States, would slavery be one of those institutions that, given that it was a foundational institution in this country, would have had to be protected? I understand, I'm being very provocative, but
No.
There are institutions that are wrong.
Yes.
There are parts of our histories that are wrong. So how do we conserve what is good and get rid of what is not good?
No, conservatism is not preserving everything and never changing anything. It's a responsible, thoughtful progress, and it's an aim to trying to preserve what is good and to get rid of what is bad. And I think in the case of slavery, I think it was in contradiction with the founding principles of the United States to begin with, and with the Constitution. A large part of this nation's history is the liberation of the slaves as well. And I see today that the identity policy left are blaming Western culture for slavery to a large extent. But one needs to remember that slavery existed in all continents, in almost all nations, but it was the Western nations that eventually abolished it. And so, looking at history, a big problem I have with the identity policy left is that they only want us to be ashamed. They're only pointing at the things that were bad, and they're not allowing us to feel proud about the things that went right, that we did in a good way. And if you would transfer that way of thinking into on a personal level, then that kind of person who are only blaming himself for everything and only looking at the things that he did wrong, never giving himself credit for anything good that he's doing, would need a psychologist. And I think that the identity policy left might also need that.
Yes.
I found it interesting that you mentioned that at the core of conservative ideology is this belief in progress but rejection of utopianism. I was wondering if you could speak, as a Sweden Democrat, to what that vision of progress is without it becoming utopianism.
Yeah, I don't believe in a perfect society. I don't believe that we will ever be able to create a society where everybody feels great and are happy and everything is prosperous and nice. And that differs, that makes me different actually, I think, from my political colleagues in the Liberal Party in Sweden and the Social Democrat and the former Communist Party, because they believe that if we just adjust things correctly with social engineering, we will eventually be able to create the perfect society where everybody is happy. And I think that is a dangerous position, because it's very easy to fall into the trap to think that, well, if we just remove quickly as possible everything that stands in the way of utopia and the perfect society, then everything will be great. So it will be worth very big sacrifices. Many of the worst atrocities in human history has been committed by people who were seeking utopia, and we're just feeling that, yeah, it's worth a lot of sacrifice in human life and in the democratic policies and so forth. I believe that it's possible to make society better. I believe we can make Sweden more safe than it is today. I believe that we can make Sweden a little bit more prosperous. I think that we could strengthen a sense of community and home in Sweden. But I'm not hoping for a lot more than that. And I think that that would be quite enough, and I would be happy if we reach that point. If we go back a few decades, in many aspects Sweden was better. In some it was worse, but in many aspects it was better. And if we can just regain that, I would be happy.
Yeah, I think it's a fair statement to say that we have more freedom of speech in the United States than you have in Sweden. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I was just wondering your take. It seems to me that the Swedish government is kind of complicit in covering up a lot of the things that go on with the problems with immigration. And for instance, I mean, like an Eritrean man can rape and, kill someone, but when you read in the Swedish papers, it says a Swedish man. Where over here, there's more description, and maybe it's in part because in Sweden there's more rehabilitation of in the system. I mean, people do hard time over here versus what goes on there. But I was just curious your take if you thought, that would ever change, because in my opinion, to find out what's really going on in Sweden, you do have to go to these alternative right-wing sites, because the Swedish government, or the general Swedish publications seem to want to hide it, and they're just hell-bent on multiculturalism. And will that ever change?
I agree to a large extent. We have several examples of how the government are trying to portray another picture of Sweden than the correct one, I think. We had a minister just a couple of years back who said that the rates of sexual violence against women is going down, 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 down. And at the same time it was going really radically in the wrong direction. And that it was in connection to the debate whether or not newly arrived immigrants are more inclined to commit sexual assault than people who were born in Sweden. And no one is saying that all immigrants, or even a majority, are committing these kind of crimes. Many are very decent people. But to even address that issue has been very, very controversial, and the government has been actively lying in international media and also in national media about these things. And today we have a situation, the latest survey made by the government Boulder crime statistics showing that every young Swedish woman have a 33% risk every year to be subjected to rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment. And that is horrific numbers. I mean, that is something that has changed dramatically. We didn't look like that a few decades ago.
What's the number?
33%.
33?
Yeah, every year. And yeah, a few years back, the government, the former government, the Liberal Conservative government, made a web page called 10 Facts About Migration, and I think 8 of them were not facts, they were lies. It was not correct, empirically not correct. And there is more limitation to freedom of speech in Sweden than it is in America. I think that is clear. We have hate speech laws that keep developing, and I think in a very worrying direction. I was one guy 6 months ago or so, or maybe a year ago, who were taken into custody, being interrogated and put to trial for saying that Muhammad was a pedophile. The Prophet Muhammad was a pedophile. And you can argue whether or not you should say these things in public or not, but it's a historical fact that the Prophet Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old girl. It's in the Quran. So it's kind of worrying that you're at risk of being thrown to jail for saying something that is, most people would probably believe is a historical fact. And there's also limitations to freedom of speech that's not really related to law, but I know a lot of people who have been fired from their jobs solely because of their political standpoint, close friends of mine. And there's still a practice that you are getting thrown out of the unions, and you have lesser protection on the labor market if you're a member of my party, and many other things that keeps people from saying what they believe in and speak openly and have an open debate because they feel they will be punished in different ways. So, and I'm hoping that America is not going in the same direction as Sweden, but there could be some worrying signs that maybe that is where it's going, especially if the new left gets its way.
I'm going to jump in. We have time for one more question. We do have refreshments outside, so these conversations can continue when you. Yes, please, you have one question.
Well, what you just said, I'm Swedish myself, what you just said that people get fired because they're part of the party, couldn't that be part of the history that not even you two are have the same opinion about, whether or not you come from the white, like racist party, or if you've left that history behind you? Why don't you agree with each other?
No, I don't agree on this description of how my party was how it started really. But in any case, that was 30 years ago, and to fire someone because what someone else said 30 years ago, I think that is kind of weird. And I don't think it's morally right to do that. For example, a close friend and colleague of mine was fired from a job as a teacher on 4 different occasions just because he belonged to my party. And he was, I think, 8 or 9 years old when this happened, and the controversies around the party and how it began. And in no instance could they prove or even claim that he was advocating his politics during teaching. On the contrary, he was very objective. And in one of the schools, they actually made pupil surveys about how the students perceive their teachers, and no other teacher in the history of the school had as high grades as he had. 100% of the students he was teaching gave him the highest grade. But then they fired him with the arguments that only 65% of the students that he never taught gave him the highest grade. But so I don't think there's any moral defense for taking the livelihood from someone just because he has a different political viewpoint than yourself. I strongly disagree with communists, for example. I would never take a job away from a communist as long as he's not advocating communism during his working hours. But I think in your free time you should be able to hold whatever position you like without being robbed of your livelihood.
So we can continue. I know there are other hands up. I would ask you all to you can applaud Mattias and yourselves for a wonderful Q&A, and we do have food outside. But thank you all for coming tonight.